Okay, so I've been re-watching some of my own videos and realizing what's missing in some of my presentation, sort of remembering things that I used to be able to sort of explain quite well about metatypes. So I'm just going to revisit the basic sort of six elements within a metatype, because I think there is a kind of useful analogy which you can sort of take from the scriptures. But so I mean, how I used to explain this was that the foundation of one side of the mind could be seen as Adam, and the child function or the lust could be seen as Eve. The firstborn could be seen as Cain, and the secondborn could be seen as Abel. And then essentially under the trial, which is essentially trying to work out what the state of the lust is now between these two things, between the ambiguity, because essentially what parent functions do is they almost try to promulgate a new lust, because essentially Cain kind of turns the lust into a drudgery. He's been drawn away by it so far into a worldview in alignment with the lust that he kind of exhausts the idea that the lust is actually going to sort of have a kind of unlimited energy, because in some sense what the lust does is it's almost exceeding the death or the foundation. That essentially it's trying to find a kind of loophole to exploit, a kind of hack, and the foundation supporting that hack is kind of like finding infinity within a matrix, or within some kind of limited structure. So it's sort of taking the rules of the structure and subverting them, or at least sort of framing them in such a way that you can kind of create the illusion of something that's infinite. And then when you're actually drawn away to sort of make a whole universe consistent with that exploitation, you actually get you end up sort of finding that the exploitation is just a trick, and you work out how to perform that trick, and you actually know how to engineer that. But then when you know how to engineer it, if you actually did it, you would be literally like a magician. You know that it's just a trick. You might be able to fool an audience, but you know that it's just an illusion, essentially. And so this is the problem of the dominant function, is that you know the trick inside out. And so you yourself are not, you need a meta child function, you need a meta lust to kind of pull you out of that drudgery. And in some sense, that's what the parent function is trying to do, is it's trying to sort of say, no, the energy of the lust can sort of be reconceived or reframed just by kind of taking certain things within the dominant function and leaving behind. It's trying to create salience. The parent function is trying to create a heuristic of salience, and a whole set of heuristics, which in the same is trying to sort of reconvene and reestablish almost the kind of the exploitative dynamic between the death and the lust, that makes the lust seemingly kind of have this infinite value attached to it. So the parent function is trying to creatively somewhat read from the dominant function in order to regain a pseudo sort of motivational, so I mean, so the parent function is very drunk on its own sort of creativity in some sense, trying to re-establish some enticement towards the lust. Now, you have to remember that it's very easy for these things to one-up the next thing, because these are higher dimensions. So you can always dupe the lower dimension. It's not hard to dupe the lower dimension and to sort of inculcate it into a grander sort of project. So the parent function can delude the dominant function, but the dominant function is in some sense, I think, more attuned to the actual essence of the lust, the original lust. And in some sense, what the parent function is trying to do is essentially disrupt the dominant function. It's trying to subvert it into a kind of, it's kind of like the wizard, so the wizard is trying to say, just accept my magic, just live on my magic. And that's completely antithetical to the dominant function, which is trying to be drawn away by the lust. So this thing that's trying to be drawn away by the lust is essentially, if it wants to collude with the parent function, it's going to undermine its own natural propensity in terms of what it's trying to do. So, because in some sense, the dominant function has some awareness of the foundation. So the dominant function knows that if it's going to be misled by the parent function, it's going to actually, because in some sense the dominant function could be seen as a synthesis of the foundation and the lust. And so if it goes one step further, this becomes a metaphor. And then the knowledge of the world according to the lust becomes a metaphorical knowledge of the world according to the lust, relative to the parent function. So there is really a kind of anthropomorphized, there's a battle of wills between the dominant function and the parent function. And because essentially what the lust is it is the exploitation of the foundation. And that is what the dominant function is trying to consolidate into a map, into a worldview, into a stable worldview. And so, people who are kind of being led by their parent function and not by their dominant function might have a very alive, they're going to be prone to confabulation, because essentially if you can get the dominant function to sort of betray itself and betray its basic nature, you're going to be prone to a cognitive dissonance as well. You're going to be heavily involved in magical thinking, blah, blah, blah. So, you really have to be careful about this, that if this isn't anchoring this. And so eventually, relative to the inferior function, and I believe that this is always so, this is metaphorically Cain killing Abel. The inferior function is Cain killing Abel, because the dominant function must win. And the inferior function will eventually side, I believe, with the dominant function. This is why the parent function finds the inferior function anathema, because it is symbolically, it is the overcoming of the parent function by the dominant function. That the dominant function eventually wins the day relative to this. So this will automatically side with this over this, which is why it will be ignored. Which is why essentially even the dominant function might want to have a little holiday sometime. Sort of in the parent function, or at least your seat of consciousness and your focus. The parent function has the upper hand here. It's in a higher dimension. So there is a kind of, let's say, natural tension here, the kind of Cain and Abel tension. Because as soon as you start dealing with this, you're kind of already in the next side of the mind, which is the whole purpose of this relay system between the parent functions. Is the parent functions are trying to create a stable bubble here, so that this but obviously the inferior function has to exist in some form. So the inferior function just becomes, the phrase, the ignoring function. So that you have the child, the dominant, the parent, and the inferior, and that's why those things kind of stand out more. But essentially, if you follow the continuation of the story, is that this is the death of the parent function. This symbolizes the overcoming of the parent function by the dominant function. And then what you are left with is that, well, you haven't actually achieved the lust if you do that, because the parent function was the only thing that was propping up the lust to still make it worth it, to still make it valuable in some sense, because this had a kind of proto child function that it was kind of projecting onto, that it was kind of sharing with the dominant function vicariously, or projecting it on, or creating an ambiguity. This was creating some kind of ambiguity around the child function to somewhat keep it alive in spirit, to keep the idea of exploitation and infinite value, and the possibility of infinite value. That this is why the parent function was being creative with the dominant function, was to try to salvage some motivational kind of impetus and anyway, but the problem is that the parent function is basically dealing in delusion. Parent function is there's a description of this in the Gita as well. It's it says that man, I can't remember the phrasing now. It's been so long, but essentially that the inferior function relates to wrath. Essentially, that it says that first you are. It's almost got the same thing as what's in the Christian scripture, but the language is slightly different, and you can kind of relate it to this as I did the Christian scripture. Anyway, I still think the Christian scripture has it sort of more precisely detailed, as it were, is more kind of technically accurate, whereas the Gita, it's more simplified, but it kind of makes it more, it's easier to kind of visualize in some sense. But anyway, so this essentially was what the parent function had envisaged is the end game, and it just kind of, in some sense, the parent function is not stupid. It anticipates that there's an inevitable way in which this ends. What the parent function was trying to do is subvert the dominant function's clear view of it. It was trying to sort of displace the clarity and transparency of the dominant function, that everything was on the square, everything was above board and on the table, all the cards face up. The parent function was just trying to sort of gerrymander it so that you could actually believe that how you got there sort of was not so much effort, so it was a kind of like way to entice your intelligence, which means in some sense that you have to kind of blunt your intelligence or kind of degrade it in some sense in order that you can sort of believe that it's still magic or something like that. And but essentially when this is, because you can almost imagine that this has a triangle inside of it, but because this has been killed by the dominant function relative to the inferior function's perspective, what you're just left with is essentially a new kind of the subtraction of this in terms of what was actually done, what is the final sentence of this and conclusion of this chapter. And essentially that would be symbolized by the birth of Seth. That Seth is born to replace Abel. And Seth, it says, is born in the image of Adam, which is symbolically the foundation of this side of the mind. So in some sense, this is going back to basics here and trying again. So it's saying, okay, well, based on this foundation, we know that this lust has failed. So, but if we just say, okay, this was all a failure, it all ended in murder because this had to lead to this, and then this was killed by that because it wasn't good enough. So all of this is a mulligan, is loss. The child, the dominant, the parent, and the inferior essentially was a bad chapter. So let's begin anew, going from here to here. So let's try again. So this will be born in the image of Adam, and saying, okay, we're going to try again. We're going to try to make a new. So this is a kind of a new Adam, or a new iteration of Adam. So, and that's essentially as well is going to say, well, we know that we have to rebel against the inferior function, because the inferior function is the conclusion of a bad chapter. So we have to kind of exploit what's gone on here. We have to avoid what's gone on here. And you can see that constructively, this is the same position as the lust and the inferior function. The same relationship recurs between this inferior function and this child function. Is that essentially when Seth is trying to be born in the image of Adam and is trying to cast off this unhappy chapter, it has to essentially rebel against or take the rules that are laden within the judgment of the inferior function, that conceived of this child, that because this holds the perfect conception of what has happened to the lust here, that has to be avoided. So this has to avoid all the structure that this symbolizes, because it's trying to essentially try again from this point of view. So this wants to sort of teleport to this. And in some sense, then you can see that this inferior function is constructively going to be fueled by, you see, like these lines of connection can, I tried to describe it before, and I probably am not going to do such a good job here, but essentially, again, like this, these things are kind of, they naturally occur within the psyche. They don't, it's not like I've described it as kind of like the numerology of just the structure of things in terms of just how the numbers kind of line up. But so this foundation of this side of the mind has to be sort of answered, or it has to be judged. This foundation has to be judged by this side of the mind. And in some sense, if you can imagine that this whole episode, sort of is the inverse image, because you have the parent function repels the inferior, its local inferior function. It's trying to create an insulated envelope. It's trying to sort of cordon itself off. So if this wants to sort of be born in the image of this, it kind of has to take the opposite view of this, because this is opposed to this, and if this wants to be born in the image of this, then it has to kind of associate its foundation. It has to kind of associate that with this, so that it can take an opposite charge. It can try to sort of avoid or exploit whatever structure is here. So it's sort of like a negative kind of sorry, I haven't dealt with this in a long time, but I'm plodding through it, I think, hopefully. And so this is being primed by this, and then this has to kind of agree with or come to some kind of negotiated identity as to what this is, so that this can be appropriately antithetical to this and can try to sort of accede to a high, in some sense. This will always be this because this will always be one dimension higher than this, so this will always be able to outsmart this, because it will have more resources, as it were. It will have a kind of meta perch to kick down against this. It just needs to know what identity it is, because if this can have a stable identity, then this can outsmart it, essentially. And then the problem is that you're still left with this basic curse, is that the dominant function will always be drawn away by the lust, create a new worldview. Obviously here, I'm using this example here as the ego. The ego is in a very unique position, because its local inferior function doesn't have a in some sense, its local inferior function was part of the ontology of the false ego complex, and as its sort of at its ontological beginning, I think it started off with a kind of bad faith and the secret devotion stuff that I was talking about. And so what I think that essentially means is that the parent function of the ego has an extra amount of power, because in some sense it still retains the memory that it does not actually need a worship, because it can preempt the worship, because that's what it did right at the beginning. So there's a kind of there's an extra power that this parent function has, that it is the strongest entity within the what I would generally call the positive side of the false ego complex. The subconscious, unconscious, and ego I call the positive, and the superego I call the negative, because the negative, like when you take old pictures on a film and it has like a negative that then gets developed into a positive, that essentially this was the kind of the, to use a philosophical metaphor, this is the kind of a priori seed of everything, and then this was the beginning of the development of the positive image from the negative. And this somewhat still retains the knowledge that it was the beginning, and it knows that essentially that there is a layer within the responsibility, within the inferior function, that colluded with the parent function, and the parent function, it does not need the support of the subconscious, because it has this starting collusion from this inferior function supplied a secret devotion to this. And so there's a kind of there's an untoward colluding sort of relationship here, and sort of uncovering this is the greatest resource, essentially, because this is the in the Matrix movies, this would be sort of how the one discovers that he is the one himself, anyway. But so anyway, my point is that this parent function is kind of like the superior parent function, but what I was just describing before about sort of the Seth, that this is Seth essentially leading on from this is what you have to hope actually happens, is that when you grow up and you start to crystallize and mature through these sides of the mind, that this has enough fidelity, this has enough epistemological impetus to actually confront the old structure here of the bad faith, and that this has enough impetus to kind of overcome this. And this is a kind of spiritual war right here. And so and this is what you would call maybe when you're 28, when you're 25, maybe, like, I mean, maybe these ages, there doesn't have to be these ages, but in some sense within our culture, I think those are the ages that I'm giving. But essentially, because we are so ethically and morally, I mean, I do think with proper education, you could probably speed this up. You could fit this into 18 years of education. But, essentially, you only really are given the independence of critical thinking and the kind of, in some sense, like, let's just say within the middle class ideal, that you go to university and you're meant to find yourself, and you're meant to maybe think about self-actualization to some degree, and you're meant to kind of, make your way in the world conceptually. And obviously, just because you're given that bubble, you're given that sort of premise, within a kind of liberal container, is not quite enough. If well, I mean, culturally at the moment, we are really quite a disaster in terms of even sorry, I'm talking, but essentially that ethos doesn't have to belong to a university student. That ethos could be woven into the fabric of in some sense the culture of society in a much more devolved kind of way. If we just had, let's say, the conceptualization of certain structures, like, I mean, this is why I promote what I call sort of moral anarchism and things like that, is because I believe that it would promote the greatest amount of potential development of the psyche of individuals, essentially. That essentially that people can't be mystified by the state, and that the state is going to provide a kind of collective redemptive project that you can sort of have your destiny bound up to, that the morality of the state is not going to sort of bolster your integrity, or sort of be your sort of coping mechanism for death denial or something. But anyway, so sort of this is the hardest part of development, probably, is that unplugging from the participatory unconscious enough to actually integrate this and assail this this bad faith, this intellectual bad faith, which is somewhat baked right into the start of the development of the false ego complex, which gives this parent function a kind of an upper hand and a secret weapon to use against whatever fidelity might develop up through this tangle and this maze of from the subconscious to the unconscious. So this would be Zion battling through the matrix to properly understand the mystery and then going further and actually dealing with the machine world underneath that, and integrating these things, kind of integrating morality and ethics with the truth of reality, essentially. Anyway, okay, I'm going far afield all over the place, but why was I saying that? So yeah, so part of, I think, the implication of what I'm saying about that this has a kind of upper hand is that this lust, this child function, has an extra kind of rigidity against becoming naturally emergent from the unconscious side of the mind. So you really have to incorporate this into this. You really have to perfect this vanity, perfect this temper, this dominant function, integrate that properly, because then in some sense your parent function can start to flip, can become your friend, so you can sort of flip the agent, so you can turn the parent function into a double agent effectively by integrating the inferior function into the dominant function, in which case the child function ends up becoming sort of a sacrificial child at that point. You actually start sacrificing the lust, and you are just kind of daisy chaining these independent. So because you've done the work of integrating the inferior function into the dominant function, then these independent nodes become integrated into a holistic sense, which for all puts power and pressure under the feet of this inferior function, which, if it can confront its own ontological iniquity at the beginning of the development, if it can confront its own bad faith and die to the sin of the world, because this is, in some sense, this is not generally conceived of as your fault, because this is in some sense the cost of development as well. But a lot of this is external. The unconscious is going to say, oh well, I didn't make these categories, I didn't make these sort of external identities, and karma, or the problem of the world, is described in Revelations as nations and peoples and tongues. I can't remember if there was a fourth thing. Nations and peoples and tongues, and in some sense, you have to understand that the largest nation that there is to overcome, especially in the unconscious participatory realm, is the imagination. That is the grandest nation that all nations fall beneath. And when you properly locate an internal locus of control that you can sort of weave through this, and eventually sort of have a stable kind of responsibility, then when you burden the weight of the world on your shoulders, that this is the only begotten Son of God, then you have the right to integrate this inferior function with this dominant function, and you are kind of cordoning off the toxicity of this, because in some sense, this parent function has been substituting this child function, and that this has been the indictment that has essentially been in a meta in a really, I can't sort of illustrate this so easily, but essentially what it structurally boils down to is that this child function is what is projecting the sin onto the ego, because you can never reach the targets that this child function is symbolizing, and therefore the parent function has every right to substitute that child function and to play a game with the ego. And so this is becoming this is a game master, like in Dungeons and Dragons. Is that what they're called, game masters? So this becomes the game master, and the ego is just a kind of self-delusion, except that these are separate entities. But you can make them a holistic entity if this can sort of jump the shark and get into here and sort of be reborn, and the new personality. And then this becomes essentially the pseudo fortified child function, that this actually becomes a new child function that actually gets what it wants, that actually executes its own will. These two dimensions in collusion with one another, this being reborn inside of this, the Son of God in the New Jerusalem, this actually works geometrically, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 4 this can metaphorically ascribe to what this is doing, or what is contained in this. So these can actually work together. These can coordinate. And then this essentially becomes, in terms of the function that it was doing, in terms of providing an answer to prime the foundation of the unconscious, this can essentially be dismantled. And this will sort of heal the nations. This is the tree of life in the center of the New Jerusalem. And you'll find that this is somewhat naturally. So I mean, it talks about or the leaves of the tree of life will heal the nations, but you'll basically, this will be a source of comfort, but it will already be done by this. So this is really the keystone to solving the thing. The beautiful city that is in the dark, that is only illuminated by the sun and the Lamb, but by the technology of the crucifixion, illuminates this, but it's in the dark. And in some sense, you could say that always the higher dimension is going to be the representative and inculcate the earlier dimensions. And so, metaphorically speaking, this is where you're going to be living around the tree of life. And in some sense, this is, but again, this is all, these are allegories for internal psychology. This is how it shines out. This is the kingdom within. And, the subconscious, your framework perspective, how you actually engage with the world. Anyway, I mean, there are probably sort of parallels to things that are described in Revelations, where it talks about the the angel throwing a millstone into the anyway, at some point maybe I'll go into maybe what this looks like after the integration. But I mean, essentially, this is how it's settled, is that this creates essentially a new ordering of these things in terms of how they are fundamentally, and what that looks like in terms of Metagram, I think, is just that you learn how to you learn how to navigate this. You know, this is like, you know, slip and slide or whatever. You know, this becomes like a water theme park. You know, you're familiar with these things, and you're not pigeonholed. You're not sort of beholden to any particular. You get a kind of dynamic way of transcending. You know, that you're not going to be stuck into a formulaic sort of reactive chain within, you know, these sorts of things. Okay. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to add that. I think I shouldn't talk too much about stuff when I've actually run out of subject to talk about. Anyway. Okay, I just want to add two small things from what I was saying just now in the last recording. The first is something that is worth pointing out. So I just want to clean up something that I was saying about the university stuff, because I didn't sort of finish that thought quite neatly. That, you know, like I realize that sort of, you know, the liberal arts university and sort of like the liberal political consciousness, I think, is the kind of the closest approximation that is required in order to psychologically develop towards this technology of the crucifixion, if I can put it like that, and that doesn't sort of get sucked into an unconscious sort of narrative abyss spiral into itself, where you just kind of take on an identity and that has a kind of cosmic super ego that you believe everybody else shares as well. So, you know, I mean, this is what happens, I think, within feudal societies, essentially. You know, you can almost see this, from the most modern representation of this is the Japanese consciousness with their emperor, you know, which was completely shattered when they heard their emperor's voice for the first time, because the emperor was a god of the collective, what was a god of the nation, was a kind of avatar of that, in some sense, that everyone could imagine that the edifice of society was being propelled by a collective, cosmic, unseen kind of force, and that everyone was participating in a anyway. So which means that you can kind of find immortality through the unconsciousness, because you can participate in a culture which you can sort of delude yourself has a kind of eternal underpinning, that everyone is playing the same game as you are psychologically, and so you don't have to resolve the mystery of the world in your mind, because it's sort of collectively being solved. So you kind of have a kind of collective destiny and a collective integrity that overshadows the individual promulgation towards responsibility and self-determinism and having a sustainable internal locus of control, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, what I was just trying to say about university, which I said a bit clumsily, is that although the university sort of is trying to inculcate that, perhaps, or at least it traditionally used to do so, but it always kind of failed, because it was almost an artificial window into that. And so, you know, usually when you start university, you're almost, well, I mean, I'm slightly, you know, giving this a contemporary sort of spin or whatever, that it's obviously artificial to some degree, because, let's say, the principle of the university or the ethos of the university is somewhat crowded out by the liberal university, as it were, is competing in other unconscious games that are being played by other people, and in some sense the liberal university is now sort of, I would say, fallen into the trap of promulgating its own kind of ivory tower, you know, monolith of scientific, you know, Tower of Babel narrative, you know, that you can have a kind of collective entrenched integrity that is ensured to you by having the right piece of paper and the right kind of collateral support from your peers. You know, it kind of has started to invalidate independent internal locus of controlled people that actually have their own understanding. It says, no, you can't have your own understanding. You have to plug yourself into the cloud narrative or something like that, because without the collateral support, you're not allowed to be specialized enough, to be interesting enough, to be listened to. You know, like you have to sort of be in the shadow of some collective entity or something like that. So anyway, but obviously that's a kind of modern trend. But what I was just trying to say is that, you know, the original liberal arts degree was all about that the individual was told the latest in everything. You were told this is the latest cutting edge in scientific theory. This is the latest cutting edge in philosophy. And you then had a ticket to be a denizen, to be a full sort of empowered citizen on the forefront of the cutting edge, or whatever, that you could herald and develop the course of things, that you could get a front row seat and participate even. That was the kind of empowerment I think that the liberal university, whatever, or the liberal arts degree sort of is meant to sort of inculcate. Now, obviously, you know, because everything has gotten so sophisticated and people have gotten into these narratives of collateral support, that's kind of fallen away to some degree, where now it's just become an institution where you have to kind of join the groupthink of some cult or something like that, of some general agenda, so that you don't have to understand it or justify it yourself. You can just kind of tap into the collateral buy-in of other people, and you can just kind of make a democratic argument. Oh, well, the consensus overpowers anything else, or you know, but anyway, so what I was just saying is that obviously, even in my ideal liberal university institution, it's a bit artificial to some degree, because even if you are primed with being treated with this kind of integrity to have an internal locus of control and to develop an internal locus of control, you have to deal with the cognitive dissonance that the rest of society isn't like this, that perhaps business isn't like this, and culture isn't like this. Culture doesn't have these same ideals and these same values. And in some sense, you kind of have to, eventually you have to take that on yourself, and you have to be responsible to that burden, as it were, and do it anyway. You know, you have to actually say, these ideals are so important that they are my normative values, they are my principles. And it doesn't matter if other people don't believe in them, I still believe in them. And you know, you with that token of that you are willing to make that sacrifice, as it were, then you actually own them. That then they belong to you, and you know, they're not granted to you. You contend them into being, as it were. And so that I was just trying to say that you don't get handed these things in university. You have to kind of grow into them. And so that's why I was trying to say that, you know, you don't kind of get them at the beginning of your university career, but hopefully if you have been educated by real educators or real professors that lecture you and really foster a sense of independence, as it were, then you kind of, maybe around 25 to 28, you actually kind of start to develop some kind of graduation from the unconscious, where your subconscious and ego are being properly integrated, because you've kind of gotten over all the mesmerizing narratives and you know, you haven't been transfixed into some Tower of Babel, which has usually a kind of sympathy to this, or covers this over, so that this will never, that you kind of believe that this is sort of part of solving a mesmerizing mystery here that has no end. And so then you're just kind of stuck in this endless abyss over here, while you're sort of virtually or in a simulated way kind of repeating some fundamental, you know, kind of incongruency from the superego. Anyway, so I did wanted to fix that about the university. The other point that I made that I wanted to clean up was, or actually just add, was that the importance of the parent functions. That in the one of the notes that I could have added when I was talking about the parent functions is that in some constructive way, you can basically understand that the parent functions eventually, because they get to jostle the system, they get to kind of put in some creative adaptation and reframing. They get to kind of try to toy with the framing to some degree, that eventually they, in some collective sense, get to reforged child functions. They, in some sense, if you, because this parent function will eventually kind of, there's a that this was born out of this essentially, and so a child function always at some point is born out of a parent function from the other side of the mind. In some sense, there's a kind of there's a sort of congruence there. There's a kind of parallel development there, and so if you can stabilize the dominant function, that you can actually start to use the parent function more responsibly, which in my view only happens when you kind of integrate the inferior function with the dominant function. Then you can kind of start using the parent function more responsibly in a creative way that isn't aberrative, that isn't generating egregious, sort of brittle constructions. Because when you can start to sort of stabilize this, when this is essentially quelled and made sort of in line with these things into a much more sort of sustainable structure here, because this is sort of, exists in two houses. This is sort of the aftermath of the failure of one side of the mind, and it's the beginning of a new side of the mind in some sense. So it's in some sense it's forming a kind of in some sense, when you start integrating the inferior function in the dominant function, then this child function starts to be used as a mediating factor, as it were. And so when you start to get all these things somewhat homogenized or stably integrated, then eventually this becomes the apex of the positive false ego complex. Positive is in the positive development, and this is the negative film that developed into this. So the thing that you essentially, this was the negative picture that was taken, the imprint, and then it positively developed into all of this because of an ontological development from the ego, and all the stuff set itself up. But if you can eventually reduce all of this, all of the positive false ego complex, into a solitary sense of responsibility, if you can sort of bring it into its full synthesis, then it's in the correct state that it can essentially fix the superego, fix the primal hurt in the superego, which is somewhat symbolized by the child function in the superego, which in some sense could be considered to sort of be the prime lust, or the and this also the prime false prophets, or the which so this was the negative parent function that developed all these positive parent functions that sort of in totality can kind of be thematically aggregated to sort of be toiling in the fragmentary kind of issue that is symbolized by this, by what has obscured the tree of life, because it is the false prophet that has obscured the tree of life, and you have been banished from the Garden of Eden, essentially, is one way to kind of frame this stuff as well. Anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to add those small things. There was one more thing which I should have mentioned as well. So, I mean, this was kind of maybe structurally, I just want to mention the two topics again, and just add another thing to each of them. So, obviously that when the parent functions are essentially I was trying to describe how they essentially determine the child functions. Obviously that determination is a kind of induction. It's not a conduction. It's not a direct determination. It's almost like inverse to what the parent functions are doing in terms of defining the inferior functions into stable identities, so that the child function can then avoid and work around and encapsulate and sort of try to parasitically exploit whatever that identity is. And so in some sense, it's a kind of by a form of magnetism, the 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 child function is induced by what these parent functions are collectively doing together in some sense. Um, with this being sort of the kind of the hidden prime apex one, or the hidden negative one, and this is the prime positive one in the ego, and then the other ones are kind of end up creating a kind of sympathetic resonance with this, as so. I mean, there's a lot of kind of thematic structure here, although it kind of is hidden in layers of, sort of that it's not directly causing this, it's indirectly inducing the content of the child function. Anyway, and I just want to say that the thing what I was saying about universities and stuff like that is, I think that what I was trying to say is that, it takes a long time for us in our current culture perhaps to develop an internal locus of control, because we have to first join university, get a taste of the liberal arts independent mentality, and then maybe grow that up further after you kind of bootstrap it within the actual burden of the world itself. And then some people attain to that or not. Some people fall into a narrative, they fall into a formula in the unconscious, or they actually try to leverage an epistemic agency and whatever. But I think that it would be much more natural to have that kind of, let's say, cultural meta-ethical development in high school. Because in high school, you could be in some sense just as liberated as you are at university, apart from perhaps, maybe what's part of the university experience to some degree is that you are sometimes you move to the place, and so you're away from home, so you have a kind of more independence to start to but in some sense it's such an artificial form of independence. And I'm even saying that it's much better if these things are constructed intellectually during a burden, of having to put up with actual systems of control that are de facto, kind of environmental, and that relate to unconscious themes. So I think that this developmental thing that I'm saying that we get to maybe in our mid to late 20s is much more natural to work through it in teenage years. And in some sense, the Romans, for example, knew this. The Romans, the aristocratic children, of the Roman aristocracy, they would, at very young ages, from the ages of 12, 13, 14, they were ruling administratively. They were learning law. They were, because there is so much intelligence, especially in a child, that if you just kind of feed it the right kind of managerial control, and or at least ability to contact things, the actual scale of development. Anyway, I'm just basically trying to say that, responsibility is something that teenagers, I think, are, if it's properly framed, if it's properly, if there's the right kind of pedagogical structure, I think we are ripe to develop this kind of liberal internal locus of control in our teenage years. I really think we are. And that's why there is so much angst and so much dysfunctional development, because these natural occurring psychological tendencies of that we want to integrate and attain towards a proper integration here get sort of slapped down by the authoritarian narrative of the unconscious participatory sort of enslavement, to just that you have to give way to something. But if you don't frame it like that, but you frame it like, look, these are fundamental constraints, let me explain the constraints to you, and you have to kind of responsibly deal with them, but they are there to be trumped. They're there to be graduated from. If you can contend an alternative and you can substantiate that contention, then why not administer it? Why not make a model out of it? Why not use that as an interface, or model it to other people to adopt and share it? In some sense, the limit of control, in some sense, is your ability to coordinate with other people, to negotiate and convince other people of your position, as it were. So, that kind of liberal, you see, like, there's a false dichotomy which people are often taught in sociology, for instance, which is that you are confined by by socialization. You are captive to socialization. It's you against the room. You can't, the famous question in sociology right at the start is, can you stand up on your desk or stand up, in the middle of the lecture hall and tear off all your clothes and get naked in front of everyone? Like, what's stopping you from doing that? Oh, it's the socialization, in your mind that you've been colonized or something like that. And I have a different spin on this. That's not actually what's holding you back. What's holding you back is your inability to coordinate with other people or to be responsible and on the cutting edge of the collective forefront of something. And you don't have to go up against the whole history and society. You have to go against, or you have to confront, as it were, the naysayers that are literally in the same room as you. It's not you against society or you against the structure. It's us against the structure. And can you convince an us? Can you coordinate with an us? Can you talk to somebody else and actually get them on board? That is the limit. That is the bridge that you have to cross. That's the only thing that you have to kind of, so are you capable of convincing anyone of your position? The idea that it should just be, well, it's your unilateral subjective preference against the collective structure of society. No. I mean, this is a false reduction. It's not, oh, we're all these atomized wills. No. We are these wills that are capable of coordination and convincing one another and persuading one another. But what are the resources of doing so? And are we confident? Because, I mean, a lot of people, they don't have the confidence of their own conviction because in some sense they don't have any conviction. They just have essentially the consensus that they have inherited, and they're too fearful to countermand it or to go a different way or something like that. And I mean, I can understand trepidation being because, in some sense, if you don't understand the substantiation of the structures that you're in, you shouldn't just throw them away. You shouldn't just uproot the fence. Which is the analogy from C.S. Lewis. You don't just go demolishing boundaries, as it were, and categories and distinctions. You don't just sort of steamroll these things unless you actually have the inculcated responsibility to actually own the effects and the aftermath and be willing. So in some sense, what we pay for the power to actually be on the cutting edge and to be producers of culture, as it were, is that we have to burden ourselves with the requisite responsibility that correlates to such. But that's a certain amount of temerity and a certain type of integrity that, in some sense, I think teenagers are, very willing to have that kind of tension burdened onto them. But, and the kind of resistance that they get in terms of their development is in some sense society saying, or their parents saying, or some authority figure saying, no, you must subject yourself to the unconscious, rather than being given the key to independence and the key to navigating these mesmerizing sort of things. And we just kind of confine them to something. But it's problematic as well, because it's not as if teenagers are immune to developing their own independent subcultural Tower of Babel and trying to displace the unconscious narratives and the other authorities with their own self-contrived authority strategy. So it's not as if teenagers are immune from becoming totalitarian fascists themselves. They are actually quite prone to doing so without a proper pedagogical line of development. But anyway, I just wanted to sort of throw that in. But that would be, I think, the appropriate point in which to instill liberal values and psychological bootstrapping or psychological sort of and you can see that probably what's happened in narcissism is that essentially narcissists, without having a stable subconscious, have had to kind of create an unconscious participatory model of their environment because it's so dangerous and traumatic. And so they are literally, their subconscious is completely overshadowed by a crystallized, concretized structure which they can't escape from, and which they have to work out some kind of power play or interface, egoic interface, to operate that kind of model, because it's the model and the concreteness of the model which they have to cling to, because that's the only structure that is stable within their current environment, or something like that. But then they also want to have a subconscious, which they don't have because it's been blown apart. So they end up having to sort of create introjective objects within this kind of environment, within an introjective paradigm, which means that they kind of have a virtual subconscious, which is in some sense echolocated by agitating other people. And so they have to kind of continually broadcast this kind of trauma that they suffered in order to sustain this coping mechanism, as it were, or this alternative to having so essentially I think that narcissists, all their problems are kind of in their subconscious in some sense, but also that they have a kind of interface, an egoic interface with their unconscious, which makes it impossible for their subconscious to ever have a stable grounding, as it were, and so that they can never anchor a stable ego either. And in some sense, they are constantly sort of trying to create a Tower of Babel that is an introjective paradigm. And all the while, I think that they are also kind of creating a stable, virtually in the so this is these three sides of the mind are the positive development of the false ego complex. This is the negative, that you can also see that they are doing something consistent in here, and they almost are creating a virtual stable state of this. And so that makes this whole mechanism that the narcissist is perpetrating very, very persistent, very, very stable in some sense. I'm just trying to think what my description of this is in the narcissist. That it's somewhere in one of my old recordings. I'm probably going to butcher it now if I try to just kind of quickly now try to generate it. I think they use the child function as a weapon. That this becomes their sort of, that this is the, you know, like in metaphysics, in philosophy, there's this, you know, sort of the, what happens when an unstoppable force reaches an immovable object, you know, so that this is either the unstoppable force or the immovable object. And as long as their unconscious essentially has them holding this special instrument, that everything else must conform to their will. So they are their identity in the center of their introjective object. They identify themselves as holding this power, as it were. But this is also then the false self of that this is the container of the false self. And in some sense, therefore, their dominant function in their superego has vast cognitive dissonance, but that cognitive dissonance is essentially cast onto other people in terms of just treating other people as disposable, or having to radically reframe things in order to kind of get away with the idea that they are the avatar of the immovable object or unstoppable force. And in some sense, they can use this with impunity, because their ego is essentially tattered and exists only to sort of exalt the introjective paradigm here. So they have no, this is quite weak because it's just a vessel of transferring the realization that they hold this. So, you know, this dominant function, apparent function, in some sense is also coordinated by the idea that they are self-identifying as this immovable object. And in some sense, this is in a perpetual bad faith. In some sense, this has got a perpetual secret devotion that is creating a virtual worship, because this thing is just so inconsistent and incoherent. You know, like this whole structure is just a kind of confabulation machine that keeps them holding this. So in some sense, that they've got this on the mind of their dominant function being held in their hand. And obviously, well, that could probably have two, and this is why narcissists can become fallen narcissists, or vulnerable narcissists, or so where you can flip from being grandiose to being I can't remember what the actual term is that Sam Buckland uses, but so essentially, that this can be on the ascendant, or this can be on sort of the decline. You're on the back foot of this, and then you can actually, when you become a sunken, fallen narcissist, or you stop being grandiose for a while, then this actually settles. Then this actually correlates, and you can actually see the contents of this, because you're actually, in some sense, this can't go forever sort of eviscerating itself. The dominant function of the ego can't go forever eviscerating itself. But eventually, sort of this parent function goes back to the grandiose. But I think if you ever become a fallen or sunken narcissist and then gone back to grandiose, you even start to gain a memory. You start to gain a memory that this actually can have a different configuration. And in some sense, you get a taste of what it looks like for this to not be fueled by bad faith. Because when you're in grandiose, this is sort of the collusion of this is, the virtual worship and the secret devotion, as I've called it before, I think is one of the main ingredients that perpetuates the narcissist's introjective paradigm, so that they can essentially project whatever they want from the unconsciousness onto the subconscious, so that they can create, because in some sense, the introjective objects that the narcissist has is constructed out of their subconscious. Their subconscious is a mannequin production unit. This is just creating identities which they think they know inside out, because they have created them out. Those identities that populate their introjective paradigm are made from their own subconscious framework, and so that's why they play with their with their puppets. That's why they play with other people, is because that is how they can echolocate the contents of these things, and feel that they have any kind of power and connection to things, is by agitating them within because then they are using other people like a collective subconscious, because they don't have an independent subconscious that is anywhere close to being integrated. They have a dispersed intelligence that is fragmented among the objects in their introjective paradigm, that is fragmented amongst the identities. And so you have to kind of aggregate those identities, and how you aggregate them is by agitating the unconscious participatory arena by simultaneously creating agitation and provocation, and that is creating a kind of echolocation where then they can collectively see how other people are responding to them, and then through their internal model of them, they can kind of come up with new thoughts through their fragmented collective subconscious, which is outsourced in some sense into the interface of the unconscious introjective paradigm. So, the narcissist is a kind of solipsist that has a God complex in which they are projecting their subconscious onto their unconscious environment. And therefore they have to act as the role player of God, because they have to set the narrative and the plot so that they can actually have thoughts, so that they can collectively come up with something that constructively amounts to having a subconscious. Generally at the cost of their ego, though, because then obviously they don't have propositions. Sometimes it's just a vessel of this thing. Okay, so anyway, it's very, very complicated. It's hard to go through it all because it's such a layer upon layer upon layer. But anyway, my next recording, I'm going to go into Metagram circuitry properly, and I'm going to talk about my model of bipolar, and also I think I'll probably be wrong about modeling schizophrenia, but I'll either be describing schizophrenia or some other kind of psychosis driven type of behavior, and I'll relate that to metagram circuitry. Anyway.